Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is part two of my agrarian series. I think it's going to be 4 or 5 parts, and today it's really going to be more delving into like the history of agrarianism, and I'm going to start with the idea of agriculture and how it pertains to politics, the ideal man, and sort of the archetype that has to do with nations. Because if you think about it, agriculture is the foundation of any society. There's simply no existing people who don't engage in it on some sense or another outside of a few isolated tribes. You could argue that many of the Amerindians and First Peoples were not agrarian in nature at all, and you can see in the Amazon people are not agrarian in nature at all. In fact, a lot of their culture and behavior relies entirely on hunting and gathering food, which is really interesting and admirable as far as I'm concerned, but it's also not practical for any modern culture, and it hasn't been part of Western or Eastern, for that matter, culture or society since several millennia ago. But yeah, let's jump in with regard to politics and agrarianism. If you look at the ancient Greeks and their republic, there were times where they were, particularly in war, they would suspend their democracy and allow someone to effectively become a tyrant. And afterwards, this person was expected to become a farmer. Afterwards, they were expected to walk away and go into what really seems like the exact opposite of despotism, complete and utter self-reliance. And that goes hand in hand. Now, in the Greek view, being a farmer still meant you would probably have slaves to assist, but you were expected to engage in what we nowadays would call blue collar or salt of the earth kind of work, kind of day-to-day activities. And then you fast forward, and Rome, they upped the ante. They expected you to do the same thing, to the point that it actually became an ideal associated directly with the patrician class. Like if you were a patrician and you were completely urbane in nature, you were disconnected from nature. Important to note that Greeks and Romans both were pantheists. So virtually everything that they worshipped, everything connected to the divine, was also connected to nature. If you were a patrician and you had no connections to nature, no land holdings or anything like that, you weren't really fulfilling that proper duties as a patrician man. You were an oddity. You were strange. It didn't make sense. In fact, I would go so far as to say that if you engaged in that kind of behavior, you'd probably be societally rejected as a freak. So right off the bat, we have this connection between nobility and nature, which is kind of funny when you look at the modern perception of agriculture. And I'll get more into that later. So let's fast forward from Greece and Rome to Britain. Now, you could use most European countries as an analog to this, but I know more about Britain than I do about, say, Frisia or the Habsburg monarchies or anything like that. So I'm not going to use any nation for that example except for Britain currently. If you look at that, that's where we start with, and it also ties in better with America. If you look at the British view of agriculture, that's where we get this idea of a yeoman. That's going to be an important term for a good chunk of this video. A yeoman is, from the British perspective, started off as like a squire or page or servant. It was a very maligned word. It wasn't something you actually wanted to be called originally, which ties into the American idea of a cowboy too, actually, and I'll get into that a little bit later. If you think about that term, it's actually a derogatory term that's become sort of nobilized by modern film and literature. But anyway, over time, yeomen evolved, though, to be someone who owned their own land, which is very different from a serf, and made their living off of that. And it became associated with honesty, integrity, which we even see now, by the way. Case in point, South Park, Stan Marsh's Integrity Farms, and even in modern commercials and anything that illustrates agriculture, honesty, hardworking, integrity, those are all qualities that are automatically going to be associated with it. Well, that comes from the British notion of the Yeoman. Or maybe I should probably say English version of the Yeoman, because in those days, when this was formulated, it wasn't exactly a unified British Isles. But to the point, it goes so far back in modern myth that Robin Hood, for example, was originally a Yeoman, and most of the merry men too. This was altered later on. I think the more modern view of Robin Hood, he's been converted into like a knight who, almost like a Ronin in that sense, like he lost his lord and that. But originally he was a yeoman. So you have this huge association between agriculture and honesty, independence, integrity, and I would even go so far as to say freedom, because yeoman stands directly in contrast to a serf who doesn't own the land that they work and relies entirely on their lord, and the lord in turn relies on the serf for their food. So I'm not actually knocking the feudal system. I'm just saying that the yeoman does stand apart from the serf as an ideal. Then fast forward to America. It gets even more heavily entrenched in that zeitgeist, because in Britain, agriculture was sort of on the way out, and you had these bigger cities, and even though people had loved the idea of nobility associated with pastoral elements, like for example, even now, if you are a British noble and you don't have, a little country house somewhere, then like the Romans, you'd be sort of seen as an oddity. That was very common. By the way, complete side note, highly recommend the 17th century body work, The Country Wife. Really funny, and I know that the word "cuck" gets thrown around a lot on the internet anymore. If you're curious about the 17th century views on that idea, it's a hilarious little play to read. Anyway, don't want to talk too much about that kind of stuff and lose track. In America, it played a pivotal role in the cultural foundation of the country. To start off with, because of colonialism, America didn't start off as urban in the slightest. Everyone came to grow things and be, presumably free from tyranny. I'm not trying to be facetious about it, but there's obviously a lot of complicated motivations for why people came to the New World. In some cases, not even willingly, but it doesn't change the fact that agriculture was the foundation to start off with. People came and immediately started growing things, because if they didn't, they would starve. So if you look at the first few presidents, they all have agricultural backgrounds, and they all used those agricultural backgrounds when they were running, because again, that association, that English yeoman idea, honesty, integrity, respect, freedom, independence, those all tie in with that. Washington was a farmer. He freed his slaves. That wasn't just because of his own morality. By the modern American definition, or I guess I shouldn't use the word modern, by the American definition, a yeoman couldn't have slaves. This is in contrast with the British view, and certainly in contrast with the Roman and Greek view. So Washington could be sort of seen as the founder of the American yeoman archetype, and I absolutely do think yeoman qualifies as an archetype, not farmer. We use that term a lot, and it conjures up that image of a guy with strong cup of coffee, wearing overalls, a cold morning, open prairie, and that's beautiful. But I think yeoman is a better term for that, because when people just use the word farmer, it can also conjure up images of antebellum South and plantation owners, or just somebody who's living hand to mouth in Appalachia, trying to grow one little thing. And in other words, agriculture is a very complex subject, and yeoman is really the more romanticized version of that term. Jefferson took it to a point where he started writing about what we now call agrarianism. And he genuinely believed that as a nation, America should singly focus on agriculture, on growing food, and not on industry. And his views of this had to do with the European model. If you look at Europe, all the way up to really the late 19th century, even though feudalism had not really been practiced directly, actually even to the 20th century, if you look at Russia, even though it hadn't been practiced directly, it was still an inherently, I don't want to use the word exploitative, but the class strata really it sat directly upon agriculture, and unfortunately for the people in the lowest class, in that agricultural class, they were not exactly valued or romanticized. They were usually the lowest rung on the ladder, and unless you count criminals, and it simply wasn't a very good system if you valued independence. Jefferson, his views were that, well, if everyone is growing things and the focus is agriculture, nobody can really be exploited because everybody's equally free. That was his view of it. And I am simplifying things, but I don't want to go on a 10, 12-minute rant about exactly how his views were structured. That being said, it does paint a picture that even from the foundation of America, agrarianism was a pivotal idea. It stood out among just about everything, to the point that you can't even have a film set during the Revolutionary era or shortly thereafter and have a protagonist who wasn't an agrarian. There's no, name a film, even a novel where someone was something else. It's interesting to note there's not really any major motion picture about Paul Revere. Interesting story, right? But it'd be harder to open with, there's Paul Revere making silver candlesticks. That's not interesting. People would be more interested if they saw him, hoeing corn. So, as you can see, it's huge. It even plays a role now. This archetype predates the cowboy as the American archetype, really. Before the American cowboy, before the American, even pioneers in covered wagons, which, we tend to sort of lump everyone in with that, even the earliest American. But before all that, you had the yeoman. That came before everything. It's real. I mean, even if you look at the cowboy archetype, what were they doing? Transporting cattle. How did that work? Well, they would sell them in towns. Where were they taking them from? Farms. What were they feeding them? Hay. Where did they get that? You see how that works? It all stems directly from agriculture. You can't say the same about a knight. Even though knights rely on serfs for their food, there's a disconnect there. There's not a disconnect with a lot of the American ideals and archetypes and characters that you could really separate from the vast fields of wheat and corn and potatoes that you see in any kind of, even a political campaign commercial. They have to start with inspiring music and amber waves of grain. It's even in the song. So it's directly tied with our identity. It's directly tied with how we view the structure and the spirit of our country. And I'm not just using a whole bunch of buzzwords rolled together to make an emotional reaction. I'm talking about it from a purely analytical view. Without that perception, there simply can't be an American identity. As much as we love our New York and Chicago and LA and how much they shape the culture due to media, without the rest of that, there's nothing. There's nothing to really talk about or write about. And don't any of you urban folks, don't take that offensively. It's just, it is the foundation of that myth. And you see it even now. Just like with the Romans were supposed to give up and go back to agriculture. The Greeks were supposed to go back to agriculture. The British nobles were expected to have their country houses. Look at modern presidents. All the way up from George Washington and Jefferson to Andrew Jackson to Jimmy Carter, the last true agricultural president. It wasn't just that these people grew things. That was part of their campaigns. And even now, the past couple of elections have been pretty sparse with this. But generally speaking, when there's an election, it is mandatory, if you have the even slightest, even most remote agricultural roots, to boast about those things and use it as a selling point to illustrate that, like Stan Marsh, you have integrity. And that's only fallen out of favor just a little tiny smidgen, and that's, I think, because of the stagflation that occurred when Carter was in office. But even with that, people adore Jimmy Carter as a person. And you pay attention next time you watch any kind of election debate. If somebody has a father or grandfather or even great grandfather who flipping grew potatoes, they will talk about it. They will bring it up. They will brag about it. So, and the reason why I'm delving into the history of agrarianism is because there's a tendency to look at it as an outdated, obsolete, and purely economic model, and one that's not good. But if we look at it, the actual history of it, it's less about economics and more about culture and more about identity and the associations that we draw from that. So it's heavily romanticized, even in a society that, on many levels, despises the idea of that kind of work. And that now I'm bringing that up. It's no longer viewed as noble work. Even though a lot of celebrities and wealthy people, one of the things that they do for their own enjoyment is that very thing, and it's because it makes people happy. And that's really the biggest argument I'm making for it. It's the kind of activities that will make people happy, and that should be your first and foremost goal in life, right? I mean, who wants to have the things that they think they want but also be miserable when they could be happy? That should be the chief goal, right? Well, if we look at the way agriculture is portrayed in modernity, aside of course from the integrity part, it's seen as a dirty kind of job that nobody should want to do, that you have to be born into to even get started, and that if you do, you're uneducated, and likely backwards in many ways. And this is a complete fabrication, and it is expressly because how do people know about these sorts of things? From modern media. Well, who writes modern media? Very, very urbane people, generally speaking, who are very disconnected from middle America. And that's one of the biggest reasons why it's so negatively portrayed. It almost fulfills Lovecraft's view of sort of the rural bumpkin who might eat you and maybe rape you, not necessarily even in that order. But that came from urbane paranoia and fears, and to a lesser extent class struggles. But it doesn't have anything to do with reality. It expressly comes from a paranoid place. It's sort of like the scary alien invaders because they're unknown. Well, if you live in a city, and then you're going to be suspicious of people from the outskirts, especially if you're, like today, dependent on them for your livelihood, for your food. So that's really all I'm probably going to talk about right now, is that in the hearts and minds of Westerners everywhere, and especially people who are culturally descended from the British ideas regarding what constitutes a people and a republic and a good person, the Yeoman archetype is huge. It really stands, it towers even over just about every other mold of human that you can construct in your mind. And that's going to play a pivotal role in part 3 when I make the case for modern agrarianism. But some of these stereotypes that give people pause, that make people reluctant to consider agrarianism, they are fabrications. And if you look further back at our myths and our history, Greco-Roman and ancient, medieval British and even American history, they run counter to those stereotypes, and they tend to run in a vein where it is a noble pursuit, a pursuit close to nature, a pursuit close to divinity. Thanks. That's all I'm going to cover right now. Look forward to the next video. Bye.